Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing the 8th of the James Bond novels, For Your Eyes Only, which Ian Fleming wrote and was published in 1960 after Goldfinger, and this is of course a compilation of 5 short stories. Now originally these short stories were to have been part of a planned project where CBS decided they wanted to try and make a James Bond television series. So after the airing of the live broadcast 1954 version of Casino Royale on their Climax series, CBS worked with Fleming to perhaps develop a James Bond series, and then Fleming developed some plot outlines and ideas for, obviously, what were to have been television episodes. This show never came to fruition, so Fleming took the ideas he had been working on and generated for the planned TV series and decided to turn them into short stories, and that was to be his next book. This was also because I think Goldfinger was the longest Bond novel to date, and Fleming had already been focusing his energies on these ideas, so it made sense to essentially finish them and combine them into a short story collection. Of course, this wasn't the first time Fleming had done something like this, as Dr. No itself grew out of the abandoned project that was to have been Commander Jamaica, which was to have been perhaps a series that Fleming would write, and that didn't happen, so he took the ideas he had generated for that, and that became the novel Dr. No. This whole idea of reusing things that had not come to fruition would, of course, also be done the next year on Thunderball, and that would infamously come back to bite Fleming and forever upset the James Bond rights in terms of introducing Kevin McClory into the equation and starting the whole Thunderball saga. I think when discussing the books, even among fans, I think For Your Eyes Only typically gets glossed over because it's a short story collection, it's not a complete novel, but it is truly important to look at in the context of when it was written. And this is Fleming at another sort of turning point of trying to figure out where he wants to go with the character, and he's able to use these short stories as a means to experiment a bit and play around. Each of these stories is extremely significant in terms of what additional layers of characterization we get for James Bond. We actually find out some of his background and certain important events, while also learning more about the day-to-day life of a British secret agent and more of the in-between assignments material we get so little of. And so there are elements of the mundane and elements of between assignments that add up to a more complete picture of the world of 007. Fleming also gets to try out entirely different genres, as one story famously in this collection, Quantum of Solace, isn't a traditional James Bond story at all. Some have even labeled it Fleming trying to write in the vein of Somerset Maugham, but that and the Hildebrand Rarity are 2 stories that allow different sides of the James Bond character to appear, and even in the more action-oriented stories, there's a sense that Bond as a character has developed further, and he's feeling malaise about himself. He's starting to feel more of that, as Fleming would famously say, that death watch beetle in the soul. He's getting older. He still doesn't like killing. He still feels the weight of what he does, and his outsider status separates him from humanity, and he has to try to hold on to what scraps of his humanity he can. But as the books progress, there is this sense that Bond has more and more self-criticism and self-doubt and self-loathing that comes and goes, as anyone in this scenario would. And these stories get to play around with that. You don't just suddenly get to where James Bond is as a character in On Her Majesty's Secret Service when that comes out in 1963 without having the developments towards that stage of his character. So I really do think the 5 stories should be looked at as a whole. They've sometimes been collected in compilations of all the short stories, yet while that's understandable, I think it does these particular stories a disservice because they were all written at the same time, and the original concept was to make them into a television series at the same time. So they are, of course, all short stories. The plots are all self-contained, and you could see them being translated to a television program that was either 60 minutes or 30 minutes minutes or less. So obviously in terms of drama, there's not much to get into in terms of the plots. So that again is why I think this book gets overlooked when compared to the other full-length novels. But they do flow into one another beautifully, and despite the plots being small or very simple, the amount of character and world detail you get is so crucial. And of course, Fleming couldn't write a boring sentence if he tried to. So here you have a writer getting to experiment a little bit, even if that wasn't his original intention. And in some stories, you get even more experimentation. So to talk about each of the 5 stories a bit, the first story is, of course, From a View to a Kill, which sees James Bond between assignments being tasked with finding out what happened to a Shape motorcycle dispatch writer who was killed in a striking opening sequence, and the secret documents he was carrying stolen, and no one knows what's happened to them or what happened to the murderer or assassin who was disguised as another writer on a motorcycle. Basically, James Bond is called in to solve a particular problem that no one else has been able to figure out, something that's been deemed a complete mystery, and due to his ingenuity and his outsider status, he's able to see what they have missed. It's very straightforward, so really the interest for the reader is in Fleming's evocative descriptions as always, the inherent wit of his prose, but primarily getting into James Bond's head and getting more of his thoughts and emotions and his opinions and the incredible internal monologues that Bond has, because this is a short story, and so we actually have more of a focus on character and atmosphere because there's less plot. The actual finale does have the requisite element of being a little bit bigger than life to give it that particular spice that you need in a James Bond story, to give it that unique flavor that only Fleming had. But the real richness is in the characterization and the detail and how evocative it is. This is where we find out why Bond has certain feelings about Paris as a city, and he opens the story sitting at a bar thinking about how his first visit to Paris is when he lost his notebook and his virginity in the same night. So we find out that Bond has particular opinions about the city of love itself, and that he feels distaste with himself, and he's frustrated, and he's between assignments, and things aren't exactly always going his way, and he's actually desperate for human connection and doesn't think he'll get it. And then we have the introduction and just a magical small bit of text in just a paragraph or two, the introduction of the love interest of the story, Marianne Russell, who is a fellow agent who is the one who is tasked to tell Bond of his assignment, and Bond even reflects on how attractive she looks and that she's obviously there for someone else, until she walks up to his table and says the phrase crash dive, which immediately identifies her as a service agent, and in the world of Bond has been a bit of a flap at the office. I think it must be said that even in the short stories where you don't have much to play with in terms of page count, that Fleming is able to create fully realized heroines that you, as the reader, actually become interested in and are fully fledged characters. And because there's a greater focus on atmosphere and characterization and Bond's growing internal turmoil and this malaise that has started to build in the series, there is an added layer of poignancy even to some of the relationships that start to develop, or I should say that have the first stages of perhaps blossoming, because Bond actually does make emotional connections even with these characters who are side characters. And this becomes important by the story's end, and one of the moments in some of these stories that I think really does echo other Fleming works in terms of the Bond series. So when you're reading these stories, naturally there is some feeling that it's still a James Bond adventure, but you'll start to note that there are echoes of the past works and there are echoes of what's to come. So the ending of From a View to a Kill is actually in a way similar to the ending of Thunderball with Bond and Domino, and it's interesting to see a sort of early version of that story trope. I think From a View to a Kill is the most straightforward of the 5 stories in this collection, and it gets the book off to a great start and drops you back into the world of James Bond, but also is already letting the reader know that in spite of these plots being smaller because they're short stories, that there is at least an added layer of having more world building and character detail to make these stories actually have meaning, and thus make it important to read in the chronological order of the published works. The next story is, of course, the title story, For Your Eyes Only, which sees Bond sent by M on an unofficial mission of revenge after the killing of the Havelocks in Jamaica, because a rogue general who was operating in Cuba and had to get out fast after the revolution decided that he wanted their property, as he was basically gobbling up whatever he could in the Caribbean to amass a small fortune. The fascinating hook of this story, and what sets up all the incredible character detail, is that this is not an officially sanctioned mission. This is M wrestling with his conscience because he was a friend of the Havelocks and feels that something must be done about the callous way they were murdered. And Fleming beautifully describes that whole sequence to such a degree that you can visualize every single element. So Bond agrees that this man should be killed and agrees to take on this assignment, which of course is completely unofficial, so it's off the books. And the villain himself has been tracked to a small villa or rented house in the woods around the US-Canadian border. So Bond actually travels to Canada and pretends to be a local hunter and gathers his materials and works unofficially with some of the local officials, and also gets a rifle for actually killing the villain, but then actually has to prepare himself and then does this trek through the woods to sneak across the border into Vermont and then set up position to where he's hopefully able to take everyone out without being spotted. This allows for incredible texture and character detail. Every single moment of the story is lived in. We get even the details about how Bond prepares himself, even using walnut stain to dye his skin, getting all the materials together, getting the falsified documentation and hunting licenses, getting the rifle that he's not been able to test, filling a thermos with a mixture of coffee and alcohol, and getting some supplies, and then actually walking through the woods and sneaking across the border, trying to not be spotted, but also trying to appear like he's just a hunter who got lost. And all the while we get Bond's internal thoughts, which run the gamut, as anyone would have when walking into an assignment like this, with all of these extra factors of it being an unofficial job and trying to not be spotted, and knowing that you're just going there to kill someone you've never met because someone asked you to, because they killed someone else that you also never met. So there are many different layers going on, and it allows for extreme depths in Bond's characterization. Then Fleming hits us with another hook, and this is the sign of any great writer. And this is where you get the genius flourish of Fleming's writing in this story in terms of his plotting. Because Bond does all this, he gets to the point where he takes his sniper's position and he's just waiting it out for the targets to appear so he can kill them and then move on. When all of a sudden we have the entrance of the beautiful Judy Havelock, who is there to avenge her parents' murder. She herself has tracked the villains to this area by any means necessary, and going through quite a lot of personal turmoil to do this, because she's on a mission of revenge. She's there to do the exact same thing, and now Bond has to deal with this new factor who has a bow and arrow pointed right at his head and is prepared to use it. Without this new introduction and complicating everything and pulling the rug out from under the audience, the rest of the story would have simply been Bond achieves his mission or Bond fails his mission. It would have been cut and dry, and then it would have been a matter of Bond having to escape back across the border. It's this left turn at the right exact moment. As I said, it's the way Fleming would add spice to a story. He would make it dramatically charged to give it the Bondian flair. And of course, it would have to be a beautiful, determined woman who is the classic Fleming heroine, bird with a wing down, who is trying to overcome a personal tragedy and is driven. And of course, it's this character who is the one who appears. It's always going to be a beautiful woman in a Bond story. And while Bond at first is taken aback and then tries to dissuade her from interfering, knowing that being less experienced than he is, she's probably going to gum up the works somehow. She insists and forces her way into being the lead assassin of now 2, and Bond now having to be the backup man with his rifle, and she has the more limited range bow and arrow. So she insists on going first and being closer to the line of fire, and it adds a palpable burst of extra suspense because now the stakes have been raised and we have to worry about this character who is new to us as the reader actually being able to carry off what she has set out to do. And wonderfully, Judy Havelock as a character earns both the reader and Bond's admiration. And so she's a fully fleshed out three-dimensional character that even in a short span of time, the audience immediately appreciates and enjoys reading about. And she's another of Fleming's great heroines, even though she's only in part of a short story. And it's her inclusion that adds the needed poignancy into this killing, because without that, this would simply be Bond acting as cold-blooded assassin, as the blunt instrument that Fleming would sometimes refer to his creation as being. Every element of the setup for the planned assassination is beautifully described, which further sets up the suspense and draws everything out just as much as it should. And then we have the flurry of action and the explosion of events, and Bond having to also try and protect Judy Havelock in the middle of all of this. And after the action, we have what is essentially a nice coda with Bond and Judy Havelock reacting to the aftermath and actually showing interest in one another in a very natural, understated way, in the way that anyone who had just gone through what they did would do. And this is one of the great moments where Bond shows his humanity and how he cares for the women in the Fleming novels, which is something that most critics of the character do not ever recognize, because he actually takes care of her wounds. He deals with her obviously having killed a man for the first time and how she has experienced a new shock and trauma, and it's very touchingly done. And in a way, Bond is also rebuking and chiding himself for his initial reaction to Judy's appearance in the first place, of, saying things like, this is man's work, you don't need to get involved. So even when you have the inherent sexism of the 1950s and 60s that appears, it's actually something that is thrown aside by the actions of the characters themselves, and frequently Bond will do things like this where he will have the innate reaction or say something to the effect of what would be a sexist remark or a typical remark that a man would say in the late 1950s. But over the course of the story and actually understanding the female character of that particular adventure, he realizes how stupid he was to say something like that. So it's a beautiful coda. I think it is the grace note on this entire story. And the way that Fleming describes how they essentially walk off into the woods is so evocative and so beautifully done that it's just, again, it's a grace note on this story. So really, I think it's the two hooks that Fleming has in this short story. That's what makes it special. That's what gives you the poignancy, because you've got the striking opening with the killing of the Havelocks. You've got this being M having to wrestle with his own emotions and ask his most decorated agent to essentially go kill somebody for him, and use a 00 agent on a personal mission of assassination. Then we have all the wonderful character building and detail leading up to what's supposed to be a straightforward killing. And then we get hit with the introduction of Judy Havelock, and that just ups the stakes across the board and adds the necessary love interest character. So even though this is a short story, Fleming makes sure to have not one but two major plot hooks, both of which are filled with character detail, raise the stakes, make this something outside of the traditional Bond adventure, and make the story unique. That poignancy I mentioned is the definition of the third story, Quantum of Solace, which is the true surprise of reading For Your Eyes Only, and the story that I most enjoy hearing people's first reactions to. This is the most atypical story in this collection, because really, outside of the bookends featuring James Bond, It's a story that's about the destruction of a marriage. It's a story about the human condition. It has nothing to do with spies or espionage or larger-than-life villains or an incredible plot. This is Fleming completely operating in a different field, completely new territory, and it's absolutely arresting. And in terms of its impact and the writing, it's probably the best story in this collection. The plot sees James Bond, after having completed another assignment, slightly bored at a dinner party with the governor of the Bahamas. Bond is sort of wondering why exactly he's there and what he's doing with his life and how he can get out of here quite fast. So after dinner, he's stuck talking with the governor for a while and says the famous line that if he married, he might just like to marry an air hostess. He's just basically saying a sort of dismissive, pretentious remark just to try and generate discussion, not that he would ever actually do something like that or something as unbelievably idiotic as to marry someone because their career was all about serving someone. Bond even says in the internal monologue that's absolutely ridiculous, and that he was just saying something to get a rise out of the governor, maybe stimulate some sort of conversation so it wouldn't be boring as hell. This spurs the governor to think of something, and so he decides to tell Bond a story about someone he knew, and this becomes the story of Philip Masters and Rhoda Llewellyn, who met when Masters was flying for the first time. Masters was a young officer with a promising future who was very closed off and, very much a social misfit and had never had a serious relationship before. Rhoda Llewellyn was the air hostess who took a liking to this man, and they became a happy couple who got married, and the happiness lasted for a while. But eventually boredom started to set in, and so Rhoda has an affair with a wealthy local younger man and sort of flaunts it around. And this slowly but surely starts to destroy Masters, who starts falling apart. Eventually, the affair ends, and Rhoda decides that she's going to try to return to her original life and apologize for it ever happening. But by that point, the Quantum of Solace that the governor references has been completely eradicated. And this is essentially the amount of humanity felt between two people. When the Quantum of Solace is gone, when there is no emotion left between the two, any relationship is beyond the point of salvaging because there's nothing there. The Quantum of Solace is gone. Then the governor relates how at this turn of events that Masters basically shut himself off towards his wife and was completely cold and distant, and the marriage finally broke up in a very, very sad fashion. The two people essentially were left to pick up the pieces of their own lives in their own way and reacted entirely differently. We then return to Bond and the governor, with Bond having been completely stunned by the story and swept up in the governor's telling of it, because all of the details are so specific that the reader can visualize and truly feel every single beat of the story that's being told, and knowing all the while that it's leading up to a rather dark and truly sad conclusion. And then Bond is so interested in the sort of ending postscript section where he's talking with the governor that he's actually asking about what happened to them after the breakup of the marriage. It shows that Bond is truly interested, and this is one of the moments where you truly feel the romantic core that's Bond's humanity underneath the cynical armor that's the shell he has to wear to protect himself from the elements that he sifts through in his everyday life as part of his job and occupation. This is where you get one of those moments where all of that has truly fallen away, and we get Bond reacting as his own self. So Bond is told what happened to Masters, and then Fleming gets in that wonderful little plot twist that, of course, what happened to the woman, Rhoda, was that she was one of the seemingly boring other people at the dinner party James Bond had attended and been regretting all the while. So you get that wonderful added little flourish at the end as the postscript for this incredible story that is the most surprising of any of Fleming's Bond writings up to this point. Again, if you were to look at the section specifically about the Master's marriage, that's a short story in and of itself. You could actually consider that as a separate story. But I think it's actually made even better having, of all people, James Bond, Secret Agent 007 as the outside observer. And it says so much about Bond's actual character in getting his reactions and how he's swept up into this story. And it even tells us more about the character of the governor, who otherwise is just a side character who isn't really fleshed out all that much. And it sets the scene perfectly. And it gives us another moment of a moment in James Bond's life that isn't a major assignment covered in one of the novels. And so the reader being given this extra little piece of where James Bond was at this particular point in time adds to our reading of his character. But this story is truly eloquent. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Fleming was a brilliant writer and that he could write things that weren't James Bond stories. He could write stories that were real human drama and didn't have any larger-than-life elements, and it still could be emotionally devastating. It is a fantastic piece of work, and I think it's the best story in this collection. And it is the biggest surprise when you come to the James Bond novels for the first time, and especially if you're reading them in chronological order. When you get to this story, you don't expect it. But if you were paying attention to what Fleming did with all of his characters and with the love interests and the romance, and how Fleming wrote far more detailed and nuanced female characters than he's ever given credit for, it's not as big of a surprise as you might think. The next story is, of course, Risico, which sees Bond again trying to break up a drug smuggling racket, which, of course, has shades of the opening of the Goldfinger novel, with Bond doing the same thing in Mexico. Here is where we see Bond dealing with the shifty and wonderfully charming Cristados, who claims to be able to give Bond the man he needs, who is responsible for all of the drug trade that is being shipped into England. And he has this clandestine meeting with Bond in a restaurant owned by that figure, which is, of course, Columbo. Columbo's there with his mistress, Countess Liesel, and they basically observe and are able to listen in to the conversation through nefarious means and a wonderful flourish and a hidden tape recorder. Bond is, of course, being set up by Cristados, who simply wants Columbo out of the way for knowing too much about him, and they are old enemies. Cristados is actually the one responsible for the narcotics traffic being brought into England, and it's just setting up Columbo as his fall guy. Columbo takes a hand by actually capturing Bond and informing him of who his enemy truly is, and this sets up the finale of the short story with Columbo and Bond teaming up to raid Cristados' warehouse and destroy it and Cristados himself. This is a very straightforward plot that is really made special by the wonderful descriptions, the atmosphere, and the wonderful interplay between Bond and our three primary characters of Cristados, Columbo, and Countess Liesel. With this story, I think it's very easy to see how it translates to a television episode. It's very visually oriented, and the story is simple and straightforward, so you could easily get it done in a 60-minute or even 30-minute television episode. The richness of the other characters is such that it immediately makes the reader think back to some of the highlights of From Russia with Love, for example. There's definitely a bit of Carimbe in Columbo, and there's a wonderful charm even in the villainous Cristados. This is even reflected in the dialogue, which is incredibly rich, and the story even opens with that, actually opening with Cristados' particular English pronunciations, which also gives us the title of this story, by the opening line being, "In this business is much risico." Once again, we do get a bit more about Bond's internal characterization because it's a shorter story, and so we do get a little bit more of that flavor and a little bit more focus on world building because there's nothing else there. Fleming also has the sort of briefing scene introduced slightly later, so the opening of the story is very much an attention grabber and setting the stage for the story, and so basically it could be said to be a sort of pre-title sequence if you wanted to look at it that that way, just like the killing of the Havelocks is for the start of the For Your Eyes Only story, and also the killing of the dispatch rider at the start of From a View to a Kill. The male characters, of course, really dominate this story in terms of Cristados and Columbo, because it's really a story of their on and off battle against one another as smugglers. And so the Liesel character is very much a background figure who is a temptress, but also is the sort of final reward if Bond can survive this assignment. So of the stories in this collection, I think Risico is more like From a View to a Kill, in that it's Bond being given a particular assignment, introduced into a situation, and it's his own talents and instincts that help him get out of it and actually complete the assignment. And of course, with the assistance of people he meets along the way. Here it's Columbo, and From a View to a Kill, it's Marianne Russell. The last story is the Hildebrand Rarity, which takes us back to the more experimental approach that was seen in Quantum of Solace. But this story is more of a fusing of a James Bond small adventure and the more experimental human drama. Bond starts the story on assignment in the Seychelles and is brought into a giant expedition as an expert diver. This is not, of course, an official assignment, but the rich industrialist Milton Crest is in town with his beautiful wife Liz and his giant impressive yacht, the Wavecrest. They're there on a mission ostensibly for the Crest Foundation to find the rare fish of the title, the Hildebrand Rarity, so that they can take it in to be put in a museum on display, and then rather amusingly, so Crest can have a tax write-off to prove his foundation is worth something. So Bond agrees to what is essentially a sort of mixture of pleasure cruise and diving expedition, but is quickly brought into this completely dysfunctional marriage where Milton Crest sees himself as a Ernest Hemingway type, a sort of macho figure who is repulsive, the type of person that Bond and especially the reader can't stand, who considers his might and money above everyone else and loves to insult others at any opportunity. His wife Liz is essentially a kept woman who lives with the whims of her controlling, abusive husband, and knowing that any wrong move might earn her time with the corrector, which is the dried tail of a stingray, which is used as a whip and an illegal thing to own, but it's something that Crest uses to beat his wife, and a particular element that makes both Bond and the reader want to immediately dispatch of this nasty character themselves. But that is the setup for this expedition, where eventually they do go to the specific area, and Crest has shown and flaunted his wealth and shown Bond around his yacht and basically acted like the sort of self-proclaimed king he sees himself as. And Bond grows more and more uneasy and doesn't really want to be there, but then they have to actually go on the expedition and search for the fish. Bond assists and hopes that Crest doesn't succeed because he can't stand the man, and in trying to catch the Hildebrand Rarity, Crest actually fills the water with rotenone and kills all of the sea and marine life in the general area, all to capture one small fish. Crest then becomes very drunk and incredibly repulsive to everyone, and then it is no surprise that Bond hears something in the night and finds Crest horribly dead with the Hildebrand Rarity and its spiked fins sticking out of his throat. Bond is left at the story's end having to essentially cover up a murder and not knowing who actually committed it for sure, whether it was justifiable homicide by the abused wife Liz Crest, or perhaps by his friend Fidele, or if it was by his friend and local contact Fidele, who had also been insulted by Crest time and time again. It's made rather clear in the last lines of the story, of course, who did away with the evil Milton Crest. But it's a wonderful sort of predicament to put James Bond in, because he's very much an outside player. He can't really do a whole lot in this situation, and he tries to keep himself removed. The only thing he really does is try to scare the Hildebrand Rarity away and cover up the murder when he finds the corpse in the middle of the night on the ship. So James Bond actually makes himself complacent in a murder, an accessory for sure in the eyes of the law, but of course carries out his own actions according to his own sort of personal code of conduct, or his own sort of ethics, if you will. So this, as you can very well see, is another of the experimental stories in this collection. It's different, but we still have James Bond acting as himself, so it remains a James Bond story, and it doesn't feel completely removed from the world of James Bond. This is just another strange place and predicament that James Bond 007 finds himself in at this particular place and time, because he agreed to what he thought was going to be a sort of pleasure cruise, and it turned out to be anything but that. This story originally appeared in Playboy magazine, and I believe was the first Fleming material to appear in Playboy, and started the long-running association between James Bond and Playboy. So this is the one story that had been published in another source before the book came out, but it was written at the same time, so it fits thematically with the other 4 stories. In looking at each of the 5 stories individually, they may not seem like they are connected, but they actually follow along similar lines, and thematically they actually feel nicely contained as a whole when you read the book. So I think they very much are representative of where Fleming was at in writing the character in 1960. And you can also see how these were generated for the same project or done around the same time. So you can obviously look at them as being designed for possible adaptation into television series episodes, but they also show the character where he was after the events of Goldfinger, and transitioning more into the later and final period of the James Bond novels, where Fleming was aiming for more literary recognition and moving away from some of the more action and pulp elements of the earlier books. So while his attempts to get a James Bond adaptation off the ground in terms of a motion picture or television series, he wound up doing some of his most experimental work to date and trying to take his creation into different areas with each of these 5 short stories. Again, I think it's important to note how some of these stories echo things that happened before them in terms of the Bond chronology, but also things that happened afterwards. So, for example, it could be said that the killing of the motorcycle rider and the enemy agent in disguise, and the whole business with the motorcycles in a sort of wooded area in the countryside and dealing with intelligence reports, is actually drawn from the backstory of Sir Hugo Drax in Moonraker, and how he was essentially bombed by his own men when a plane flew overhead and didn't realize that he was in disguise. So I think these little echoes actually show where Fleming's head was at, and how even these short stories themselves, as out there as they could get away from the traditional Bond novel formula, were still connected and part of the same world. And it shows elements he was already sort of toying with and would actually bring into later works. So now we turn to looking at the various adaptations of these stories. The first is, of course, the Daily Express newspaper strip, which was still continuing. So Henry Gamage wrote the adaptations, and John McCluskey once again did his iconic artwork and rendering of James Bond. So across 1961, they did 3 of the 5 stories. First was Risico, and then came From a View to a Kill, followed by For Your Eyes Only itself. Once again, we have a perfect blow-by-blow account of the stories now in visual form, with the iconic, much more harder-edged and pulp hero-looking John McCluskey version of James Bond that was an enormous influence on the development of the Eon films, as most people were only familiar with the newspaper strip. There were far more readers of the strip than there were Fleming's novels, even though they had become more popular. What's also notable about these is that you get a very detailed rendering of the short stories because the plots themselves are short, so they still had to fill a certain amount of time with a daily strip running for weeks on end, and this actually allows the adaptation to be more detailed than it was with some of the novels. Again, I think the highlight is McCluskey's artwork, because the adaptations themselves are so direct that it just feels like an abridged version of the novel. There's not really anything different, so you just get the odd experience of saying what you know and what you've already read, and so it's just what can the visual medium do, and what things might they streamline in order to fit it in this other medium. So the real highlight is seeing how the visuals depict certain moments, such as the climactic raid on Christodos's warehouse. The same goes for From a View to a Kill, as you open with the killing of the dispatch writer, and then the introduction of Bond being brought into this assignment. I would say the highlight of these is the actual depiction of action. So when we get to the climax with Bond's discovery of the secret hidden lair of the saboteur agents, we do get the action from the end of the story nicely visualized. Then we have the adaptation of For Your Eyes Only, which again is a direct translation of the short story. So we have the killing of the Havelocks, Bond's briefing with M, where he agrees to take the unofficial assignment, then going to Canada and preparing himself to sneak across the US border. Then we have his setting up and staking out of the location, where he is confronted by the beautiful Judy Havelock. And again, I think the highlight is how the climactic action is depicted. So these are very good adaptations, but again, they have all of the pluses and minuses of the Daily Express strips. In terms of the adaptations are very direct. They basically recreate the plot of the original source material beat for beat, but in serialized daily form. And so the draw is then how much do the visuals grab you, so at least they have the amazing artwork by John McCluskey. So these are essentially lovely visualizations of Fleming's Bond in a different medium, but the actual adaptations don't bring anything new to the table. The newspaper strips continued throughout the 1960s, and by 1967 they had exhausted most of Fleming's material, but at that point they decided to actually adapt the Hildebrand Rarity. But by this point the artist and writer had changed. So the art is by Jaroslav Horak, who has a very different style to John McCluskey, but one that is equally bold. But the adaptation of Fleming is by Jim Lawrence, who also wrote the various original stories that were done for the running newspaper strip. But what I didn't realize until recently is that the Jim Lawrence who wrote this adaptation and the other original newspaper strips is actually the same James Lawrence associated with the Stratemeyer Syndicate who actually wrote some of the revised and rewritten Hardy Boys books under the ghostwriter name. He actually wound up writing a great number of the Tom Swift books and a variety of other classic series, not to mention books for other publishers and other forms of media, both under his own name and under pseudonyms. So in looking at what they did with the Hildebrand Rarity in 1967 is to have an absolute sea change in comparison to the earlier Fleming adaptations where the strip was basically just retelling what happened in the book beat for beat. This adaptation of the Hildebrand Rarity at times seems like a completely different story, yet still retains the same basic plot. By this point, the James Bond films had taken off, and the spy craze of the 60s had been in full swing and was about to start to taper off, as this was the year You Only Live Twice the film was released. So doing a very small story that's also experimental and has James Bond covering up a murder without some larger-than-life plot or some mega villain twirling his mustache, it meant that you had to do something to try and make the story a bit bigger, and also they had been doing that in the strips leading up to this. So this means this adaptation basically is a fully fledged story of its own that still remains the Hildebrand Rarity. So right from the start, you can see that Horak's artwork is extraordinarily realistic until you get to the actual faces, which have a particular unique style that at once suggests realism, but also a certain perspective. So it takes a little getting used to if you've only read the earlier strips with McCluskey artwork, but it is really striking and fits this world. The plot is strikingly original in terms of how it handles the story, because essentially you have an entire secret weapon project, which is a remote-controlled submarine that's a joint operation between the US and Great Britain that is lost at the bottom of the sea. And then you have a desperate attempt to try and find it before others might get their hands on it, and of course get it to the Russians. Does any of this start to sound familiar? Because even though it's a remote-controlled submarine, it's impossible to not see and make parallels to the 1981 For Your Eyes Only film and the ATAC device. We have Bond being brought into the assignment, so there's an exclusive M briefing scene. Basically, Bond is sent to the area to try and figure out what happened to the secret device, and is eventually brought into the world of Milton Crest and his expedition to find the Hildebrand Rarity and, of course, his abused wife Liz Crest on the Wave Crest. So you then run into the story elements of the original Hildebrand Rarity short story. But that becomes the B plot, or the secondary plot running behind the main plot, or the A plot, of what happened to the secret submarine device, and is someone actually trying to secretly salvage it. And of course, Milton Crest is revealed to be one of the industrialists who helped finance and build the project. So he has inside knowledge of it and is actually involved with foreign powers. So there's a lot more at stake here, yet it never loses the original story of the Hildebrand Rarity. That's the genius of this adaptation. There's also the introduction of the femme fatale, as Bond's friend Fidele from the short story becomes the femme fatale / mistress of the villain, who actually manages to increase the drama of the story, because you have the classic conceit of the villainess starts to develop feelings for James Bond and realizes she's more of a pawn in the villain's scheme and doesn't necessarily mean all that much to him. So the story rather effortlessly switches between the two plots. So you get wrapped up in one, and then you come back to what is essentially the Hildebrand Rarity story of Liz Crest being abused and Milton Crest being absolutely loathsome, and Bond wanting to intervene but trying to stay out of it. But then there's the ticking clock always of the A plot of the missing submarine. When you read this, you'll be thinking of the 1981 film constantly, because even though the actual MacGuffin of the story is different and it's using a different Fleming short story mixed in, it is basically the same approach that Richard Maibaum and Michael G. Wilson took in developing and writing the 1981 film. So I think this had to have been an influence in creating that story. Or, of course, it could be completely coincidental and they merely took the same approach. But in looking at this, there's so much that prefigures what happens in the 1981 film. And of course, there's quite a bit of underwater action, including going down to the down sub underwater and dealing with the enemies underwater. We get to the same conclusion as the short story, but with plenty of action thrown in, and everything is much bigger due to the A plot and feeling necessary to have a bigger experience to match what a Bond story had become by 1967. And again, the artwork is extraordinarily striking, just a different style to what McCluskey had done before. So the Hildebrand Rarity is easily the best of these comic strip adaptations of the stories, because it's actually doing something new to the original material while still retaining all the same story beats. So there's something for the reader and the Bond fan to sink their teeth into, instead of just a very faithful retelling of the story you already know. But it's really striking that Jim Lawrence hit upon the idea of grafting this story onto a plot featuring a secret weapon lost by British forces underwater, and then it having to be recovered before others can get their hands on it and perhaps get it to a foreign power. He hit upon this in 1967, and the Eon film took the same approach, mixing a concept like that into Fleming short stories from the For Your Eyes Only book in 1981. So basically, this is an alternate universe what-if version of that same concept, or the For Your Eyes Only film, but in comic strip form in 1967. Quantum of Solace is the lone story that wasn't adapted in the newspaper strip, and that's really because it's a story about a doomed romance, and James Bond is only a side character, observer. It would have made a very striking comic, but it would have been much more of a romance comic than the action strip of the Bond strip. So it makes sense why they didn't do it. But of course, it would have been nice to see, since they did the other four stories. But that's the one story of For Your Eyes Only that was left out. So of course, we now have to look at the 1981 film adaptation in the official Eon series, For Your Eyes Only. This was designed from the ground up to be a response to the excesses of Moonraker in 1979, and started the trend of all of the 1980s films in the series being credited as co-written by Richard Maybaum and Michael G. Wilson, and taking pieces of Fleming's short stories and other pieces of the Bond novels that had not been used in films, and basically patching them together to create newly original stories that were then fully grounded in the works of Ian Fleming, because they were taking all of these pieces and short stories and trying to build something that was current and modern, yet rooted in Fleming and completely grounded, so it felt appropriate. This really was the perfect approach to take, because at that point they had exhausted most of the novels, but they had all the short stories and they had all the pieces of the novels they hadn't used. So there was enough material to create a new Bond adventure out of unused Fleming material, and they hit upon the concept of doing this while also keeping the stories and the plots topical to that particular moment in the 1980s. And if you look at the 5 80s films, they are all directed by John Glenn. They all have similar elements, and they all build upon one another. So what For Your Eyes Only starts in 1981, License to Kill finishes in 1989. The plot's construction takes the same approach as the 1967 newspaper strip. The film takes the short stories For Your Eyes Only and Risico, and then other unused bits of Fleming, in order to create a new story. The new primary plot is the loss of the ATAC device, which, if it falls into the wrong hands, will allow the Russians or anyone else to control and order around British nuclear submarines. So this starts the ticking clock of the film. It was lost on the secret spy ship, the St. George's, somewhere in the Ionian Sea, and they have to start a recovery operation, but do it quietly and discreetly, while, of course, others, backed by the Russians, are trying to find it. The opening act beautifully works in the For Your Eyes Only short story by having the Havelocks be the ones who are actually discreet British operatives looking for the wreck of the St. George's, and they're killed by the hitman Gonzalez, basically taking the opening of the short story and transposing it to the film. And now Judy Havelock is renamed Melina, and she shows up at Gonzalez's villa, surprises Bond, and assassinates him with a crossbow as he dives into the pool, basically translating that particular moment from the short story. This brings Bond and Melina together, and the romance of the film, or Melina as a love interest, is taking her introduction in the short story of being a woman hell-bent on revenge and closed off to everything else and being very standoffish. That becomes the emotional crux of their relationship in the film. So that is stretched out over the course of the film, whereas in the short story it all took place there. The film transitions to Greece, and this is where we have the adaptation of the Risico story. And we have Christados and Colombo. We have Christados passing himself off as the good foreign ally of Bond, trying to get Bond to do his dirty work and eliminate Colombo. We have a perfect recreation of the wonderful scene in Colombo's restaurant where the secret tape recorder reveals Bond and Christados' conversation. We have the introduction of Countess Liesel, and we have a similar scene on the beach, though far more dramatic, where Bond is then captured by Colombo, who then reveals that Christados himself was the villain, and this leads to the nighttime raid on Christados' warehouse and finally tracking down the villain. Except here, it's of course Locke and not Christados himself, because the film has to have the bigger action climax with the climb on the Meteora, and then the final battle with Christados and associates, trying to stop them before they can hand over the ATAC to the arriving General Gogol. So you can definitely see how the screenplay beautifully weaves in not one but two short stories in this collection, and manages to have everything feel natural. It never feels forced or like you're suddenly hitting a closing point in Act 1, or the For Your Eyes Only act transitions into the Risico act. You know, it is very seamless. You don't notice this unless you're looking for it and you're analyzing the story construction. There are other little unused bits of Fleming woven in. The most obvious and definite example is the usage of the keel hauling sequence from Live and Let Die. That was the final climax of that novel and wasn't used in the film, so they were able to use it here when Bond recovers the ATAC, and Christados feels he must have a more entertaining way to eliminate Bond and Melina. And so even the usage of the keel hauling sequence doesn't feel forced or like they just cherry-picked something they hadn't used. It fits the scene, and of course they're on the water and there's a coral reef there, so it is fitting that the villain might decide to keel haul them instead of just shooting shooting them and being done with it. So the genius of For Your Eyes Only, the film, is that it's able to effortlessly weave together new plot elements with all of these unused pieces of Fleming and the 2 short stories, but make it seamless and make it something that stands on its own. As part of the marketing campaign, there was another adaptation of these story elements because the film was adapted into comic form by Marvel Comics. So in 1981, we got a 2-issue adaptation, which I have to the original 2 issues here. They were later collected into a single volume with different cover art that I'd like to get. But this is basically a direct adaptation of the film story condensed down into just 2 issues. So of course, this means the elements of For Your Eyes Only and Risico are in comic form, once again, counting the newspaper strip as well. But this adaptation is basically directly following the events of the film, but also extremely abridged, as certain action sequences and other famous moments from the film are condensed down into a few panels, like maybe even only 1 or 2 panels, such as the famous Citroen car chase is over in a single panel pretty much. The ski chase is condensed down to almost nothing. So, it leaves a lot to be desired, but at least it's cool there was a comic tie-in, but it means that technically there is this other comic adaptation of some of the For Your Eyes Only short story elements. As for other films in the series that have elements of the For Your Eyes Only stories, there are a couple little things. Of course, From A View to a Kill had its title appropriated for the 1985 film A View to a Kill. They just dropped the from, even though early announcements still had it. I guess it was felt that From A View to a Kill didn't sound quite right. Essentially, that's all it took from the story, but if you examine the film closely, there's a couple connections you could make that are kind of on the looser side, but the film does have an extensive sequence in Paris, so that ties in with the short story with Bond being in Paris, and then the action of that part of the film takes place at Zorin's estate outside of Paris, so that kind of matches Shape headquarters outside of Paris, and Bond being brought into a particular conundrum that nobody's able to solve, and with him being an outsider and using his instincts, he's able to piece it together. So the killing of the dispatch writer and the secret lair is like Bond figuring out how Zorin cheats at horse racing, and of course Bond sits around observing and is able to see enemy agents going into the secret elevator hidden in the horse stables that leads into the secret lab, much like Bond in the short story, waits around and sees the enemy dispatch writer come back to the camouflage secret lair underneath the mound in the open field with all the fake plants and the periscope flowers on it. So there's a couple little things like that you could draw as parallels, but that took me thinking about it quite a while to suddenly realize that there were some echoes you could draw outside of just reusing the title. The films would never directly adapt the Hildebrand Rarity, but several elements wound up being used in License to Kill. We have the opening where Sanchez uses the dried tail of a stingray as a whip to beat his abused mistress Lupe Lamora, so she basically takes the place of Liz Crest. We also have Milton Crest and the Wave Crest, basically appearing as they do in the original short story, but this is now worked into Sanchez's drug-running empire, and so Bond basically is disrupting Sanchez's empire and interacts with Crest and sets him up and finds him absolutely loathsome, and on the Wave Crest, Bond runs into Lupe and realizes that Sanchez beat her with the Stingray whip. We see the scars, and that furthers Bond's desire for achieving some sort of justice or vengeance against Sanchez, outside of the central conceit being drawn from Felix Leiter being thrown to the sharks from the Live and Let Die novel. So the film is taking the unused piece of Live and Let Die, the book, as the jumping off point for a new story that eventually becomes the sort of Red Harvest Yojimbo Fistful of Dollars plot of tearing apart the villain's entire infrastructure by playing themselves off against one another. But peppered throughout, there's actually quite a bit of of the Hildebrand Rarity. So that was a nice way to use that story because it was such a small experimental story that meant it didn't really translate to being directly adapted into a Bond film experience. And that film also uses quite a bit of Diamonds Are Forever, the novel, and other bits of unused Fleming material. So if you examine the 80s films, you can find little tiny pieces like that. But License to Kill is basically taking the Hildebrand Rarity elements of Milton Crest, the activities at sea, the Wave Crest itself, the drug smuggling taking place underwater could be said to take the place of searching for the Hildebrand Rarity fish itself, and Lupe is essentially a reworking of the Liz Crest character, but also with elements of the Tiffany Case character from Diamonds Are Forever, the novel. There were also two elements used in the Daniel Craig era. First, in the original book For Your Eyes Only, the name Solange is referenced, so that was actually reutilized in the 2006 adaptation of Casino Royale with a side character. Quantum of Solace was finally used by Eon, but unfortunately they just took Fleming's extremely poetic title and slapped it onto the second Daniel Craig film. So it doesn't have anything to do with the original short story, and that story doesn't really allow itself to be adapted into a Bond film unless you use the framing device of Bond having a story related to him and just make it a character piece. Whether you actually use the story of the dissolution of the Master's marriage or not, you could take the setup and use it in the film if you wanted to. But essentially, it was a Fleming title that hadn't been used, and they finally stuck it on that second Daniel Craig film. And had the story and script of that film actually been worth a darn, it could have actually worked, as the film was conceived as a direct sequel to the 2006 Casino Royale film and was essentially Bond trying to find himself once more after the death of Vesper Lynd and reacting to the ending of that previous film. So, it made sense why they were going to use the title, as that film is essentially Bond having to find his own Quantum of Solace once more. But the film doesn't work and is a hot mess, and this was compounded further by the film being made during the writer's strike, and they really shouldn't have done that because it was never properly worked out, so they just made it up as they went along, and that's why the film is such a mess. So unfortunately, one of Fleming's most beautiful and poetic titles is now forever associated by the general public with the film that's really a piece of junk. There are some rougher elements in that film that do harken back to the literary James Bond, but it's really an incoherent mess throughout and doesn't work. And that's all tied to the production problems and the Writers Guild strike. So it's just unfortunate that when you say Quantum of Solace, most people, if they even know that phrase, they immediately can only think of the second film of the Daniel Craig era, and they typically have no idea that that title comes from one of Fleming's most beautiful and grounded stories that has nothing to do with a spycraft or action-adventure. And so I try to get people to actually go read the story if they haven't before, because it's so well done that hopefully they then might think better of the beautiful title and not think of the messy film. Now I'll talk about the various book editions and cover art designs that have been seen for Your Eyes Only over the years. The original 1961 UK edition by Jonathan Cape, of course, features iconic Richard Chopping artwork once again, but this in a different style than his most iconic sort of wood grain background with incredibly detailed objects. So here we have For Your Eyes Only stamped across the top of what appears to be torn secret official paperwork. So this is drawn from M. handing Bond's the information folder in For Your Eyes Only, with it being stamped that, as it's of course an unofficial operation. But the page is torn at the top, and then we have what looks like the peephole in a door or a piece of wood, and an incredibly detailed drawing of an eye there. And then we have Fleming's name and credit inside of have the identifier plate. So this very much looks like it's an eye peering through a door into the world of the stories contained. And of course, you have the direct connection to the For Your Eyes Only title, but also how in these stories Bond is very much an observer and other people are always observing. So you have Bond acting as assassin or sniper in For Your Eyes Only. You have From a View to a Kill with the assassin watching the motorcycle rider and then Bond laying in wait and watching the target area. You could even say this cover references Quantum of Solace, with it perhaps being a representation of Philip Masters looking in on the destruction of his entire world from outside the door. And I suppose you could perhaps draw some linkages to Risico and Hildebrand Rarity as well, but it's a very evocative cover. It's very beautifully done, and it's also nice that this is a Richard Chopping cover that does something different. It's not doing what he did previously on Goldfinger and From Russia with Love, with the most iconic artwork that he would do. So it's beautifully designed. It's got a lot going on, and I really love what it's doing and how it directly references the stories. When you switch over to the US first edition, this is another that thankfully reuses Chopping's artwork, but it is modified slightly. For Your Eyes Only as a title is now across the whole top. It's still in red, but it's a bit more obvious what it's doing. And the overall detail and color and contrast is played around with, so it's basically a slightly modified version of the original UK cover. In 1961, there was a lovely UK book club edition in the same overall style as the one they did for Goldfinger. So it's again a mixture of black, white, and gold, and very attention-grabbing while also being very direct and simple. So the illustration is by W.M. Cuthill, or Cuthill, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but we have the highly detailed eyes in black and gold on a striking black background with basically a sort of letterbox aesthetic because they're just in the top third. And then in the center, it's broken up with the title in black and white, and then Fleming's name on the bottom in a gold stripe. So you've got the intersecting lines, you've got the bold eyes, and then the different colors breaking it all up. So it's very attention-grabbing. I think it's a wonderful match to their previous edition of Goldfinger that did the same thing. And I think this is one of the best cover artwork designs for the book, even though it's very simple and direct. The first Signet US paperback also carries the tradition of the early Signets having a much more pulp thriller aesthetic to their cover artwork. So here on For Your Eyes Only, we do carry over the motif of the sort of torn page at the top from the first edition Chopping artwork. So on the top, we've got the 5 secret exploits in the life of indestructible agent James Bond, with Fleming's credit running across the top left, which gives it that sort of secret file folder look. And then on the bottom half, we have the title in a nice sort of stylized font. And then on black, we have the image of a beautiful blonde wearing a dress with a plunging neckline. And then behind her, it looks like she's emerging from the depths of maybe hell itself, or there's like an explosion going up behind her, or it's like a volcano or something. But it's just very ominous and striking, the mixture of beautiful woman, red and black. I don't know who this is supposed to signify. It could be one of a number of the female characters in the stories, but it is a very eye-catching cover that manages to translate the basic idea of the original Chopping artwork, but with a much more pulp fiction aesthetic. The UK Pan paperback has artwork featuring a beautiful blonde in dress with plunging neckline, which seems very similar to the first US Signet artwork. But here she's standing in front of a sign that warns against death, which I'm thinking is perhaps talking about the mined beach in the Risico short story. So I'm thinking perhaps this is Countess Liesel, but again, it could be one of a number of the female characters in the story. The background has a sort of wood grain aesthetic, so I'm not sure what that's supposed to represent. But otherwise, we have the classic Pan layout of the title in yellow, and then of course across the bottom we have the original incarnation of the famous 007 gun logo. So this is in keeping with the other Pan paperbacks and saw a updated printing. So you have the Great Pan version version and then the non-Great Pan version, for example, but they are overall the same cover artwork. In 1965, we saw the updated UK Pan paperback. In the mid-60s, James Bond branded paperbacks. These always focus on a central item related to the story to make a very stark and bold cover. So here we're actually focusing on the For Your Eyes Only stamp itself that M uses to stamp the secret documents of the unofficial assignment in the story of the same name. So it is very fitting and it works, and it's also a bit more attention grabbing because, of course, the stamp is reversed. So you have to actually look and pay attention to read the title. You have to reverse it in your mind. There's also what seems like the sort of background of, I'm thinking, a sort of leather case or a suitcase that the stamp is resting on, because there's the sort of lock or latch on a suitcase or paper case that would contain the secret files. So it works and it is very attention grabbing, but it's also very, very stark. So it's one of these covers that works if you pay attention. The updated 1965 US Signet paperback brings the book into the iconic classic 60s Signet design. So it's got the same uniform aesthetic with Fleming's credit in the title and a certain usage of different colors. So this time the background is gray and the title in a sort of off purple. And then on the side, instead of a James Bond thriller, we have 5 James Bond thrillers. So that's the one distinction for this being the short story collection. The artwork is again by the great Barry Phillips, and it's very simple in terms of it looking like Bond looking through a pair of binoculars, but this again carries across the aesthetic of a lot of the stories having observation as a theme, and Bond also acting as potential assassin multiple times, and also the themes of assassination and killing and looking through scopes or glasses at something, not to mention fitting with For Your Eyes Only as a title itself. And as always with these, the artwork is very small on the cover, but that actually makes it more interesting in a way. These are always more evocative of the world of the story than expressing specific detailed moments. So I think this is very fitting, but it is very understated. Later printings of this would of course get updated with the 007 Pages logo in the corner. This is what you find on most later Signet printings, where in the other upper hand corner they've put what looks like 007 behind other pages. So you're like going through a stack of papers and then you suddenly reveal 007 there. In 1972, Pan would update the book in their refresh line of white cover paperbacks, always focusing on a beautiful central female figure to represent one of the main female characters of the story. So on For Your Eyes Only, we have, I think, one of the best in this series, because it's obviously Judy Havelock, complete with her bow and arrow, in a striking pose about to fire at the reader, and it's on the really stark white background. Due to the layout and design, the character on these covers is usually a lot smaller, and some of the title layout seems to be drawn from the 1965 Pan series. But I think these are good for what they are, and they do look really nice when you get to look at all of them side by side, so you can see the uniform matching quality. But this is one of the few times where you have Judy Havelock in her full Robina Hood phase, as Bond describes at one point in the story, and everything about this really works. And I also like how the title is in green to make it stand out from the white and the black. So I think this is extremely well done, and the rendering of Judy Havelock is really good. So I just love everything about this. It's very simple, very direct, and on the surface, it has more of the flair of, say, a paperback for a Tarzan spin-off novel or something. But I just really love what they did with this. It's very simple, and I think it's one of the best of this series. In 1974, we saw the Pan update to the Still Life series. This is, of course, referring to the covers in this series all being intricately designed photographs featuring items specifically related to the actual story within. These might not be as obvious to the first-time reader or might take real study to figure out what they represent, but they are all directly connected items to the story. Basically, I think continuing the concept of the 1965 Pan paperbacks, but taking it to a much higher degree. So here on the cover, we have photographs. We have what looks like the motorcycle helmet of the the killed dispatch rider, and other odds and ends to suggest the 5 different stories. And once again, we also have the title in a sort of off green to make it stand out. So all of these covers are ones you really have to look at and pore over to try and figure out. And that actually makes them more interesting for the Bond fan, because as a fan, you get to play spot the reference. In the late 70s, Triad Panther brought out what is known as the Girls on Guns series. This is a uniform set of reissues that all feature beautiful women draped across guns that are all gold-plated. So here on For Your Eyes Only, we have a beautiful blonde draped across a gold-plated 45. It doesn't really have anything to do with the story outside of perhaps the woman maybe representing one of the characters in the story. It's really more of a design aesthetic for this reprint series, and the gold-plated 45 makes you think of Scaramanga's weapon of choice and the Man with the Golden Gun. 1981 saw a variety of tie-in paperbacks, with Triad Panther coming out with their own extremely pulp men's adventure style cover with what is actually a quite interesting piece of artwork. So here Bond is directly taken from the For Your Eyes Only short story with the sniper's rifle and sort of hunter outfit, and he's paired with a beautiful brunette and a plunging half-open shirt across a sunset red sky, and then we have what looks like the wave crest on the bottom along with the sea and the rocks, and then some figures of action firing automatic weapons in the center. So there's quite a lot going on with this cover. It's very bold, but also in a way it's kind of generic. You could see this being used on any sort of men's adventure paperback around the late 70s, early 80s, just with a different title, and it would be fitting for something like that. There are a couple elements that link it directly to For Your Eyes Only, but only if you're looking for them. And then, of course, we have the James Bond and Fleming credit on the top, and then we have the marketing blurb on the bottom corner in yellow, hyping up that the film is out, and this is the inspiration for the, as it puts, major new James Bond film. So it's definitely a movie tie-in, and if you look closely at the likeness of Bond, it seems tailored towards Roger Moore. It's actually one of the better examples of this in terms of working in the film actor of the time into the depiction of Bond, but the positioning of the rest of the character seems a bit weird. It's kind of like they just stuck Roger's head or face in there. Because this cover to me has always seemed like the head is a little bit smaller than the body is, and then the position of him standing next to the scantily clad woman, basically looking like giants standing out of the ocean. It works, but the more closely you examine it, the less it actually does work. But I think it's a pretty good cover, and you also get the added detail of the sniper rifle actually crossing over the title. But it's one of these covers that I like well enough, but the overall impact is a bit mixed. Jove Books did their version in the US as part of their series at this time, also a movie tie-in. So we again have the yellow banner hyping up the new film, but this time across the top. This is in the style of the other Jove books, where you have what it could be best described as a sort of comic book depiction of James Bond and other figures who are supposedly from these stories, but these would typically have a burst of color with some sort of locale. Instead, here, they went for a really nice use of the Union Jack, so I think this works quite well because they did this instead of having 5 different locations for the 5 stories. The image of Bond is maybe referring to Roger Moore, but it's more generic. The Jove cover designs would typically have Bond look a little Roger-ish, but more of a sort of generic amalgam Bond. But the other figures, we have a beautiful blonde who could be one of the female characters in the story. And then on the left, we have what appears to be, I suppose, the motorcycle assassin in From a View to a Kill, because he's got the uniform and the helmet, and he's firing what looks like a silenced pistol over one arm. So that would be my guess, but of course he's standing up and there's no motorcycle, but that's what I think that's supposed to represent. And then Bond is just looking very cool, collected, and not bothered as he's checking his sunglasses. So it's an okay cover. I think what really makes it work is the Union Jack background. So for that, I think it's one of the better Jove covers, but they always have that sort of generic element to them. Shortly later, in about 1983, Berkley published their updated printing in the style of the John Gardner continuation novel paperbacks. They were slowly bringing out each Fleming original novel in this style with the updated typeface and then the uniform cover. So this has a usage of dark blue, light orange, and sort of off pink to purple background. And then the action pose of Bond is on one knee, holding out silenced pistol. So it works, but these covers do take a little getting used to, especially the mixture of really bold covers. The dark blue doesn't exactly gel, but it does make the James Bond logo stand out. I do like the usage of the action poses. I like the layouts of these. I grew up with this sort of style, so I'm very used to it, but I know not everyone is. This one, I think it's solid. I think it's just the color choices that make it less effective than some of the others. This would see two slight updates in 1985 when A View to a Kill was released. So one version merely added a blurb on the bottom saying that it featured From A View to a Kill, the story, and then the other also added an actual white strip blurb across the center of the book printed on that said, don't miss the new Bond film A View to a Kill. So you get the inherent fun of the book hyping that it has From A View to a Kill that was adapted very slightly into the film A View to a Kill. So you've actually got both versions of the title on the same book jacket. In 1989, Coronet Books in the UK published their paperback version in the style that was a uniform set. So like the Berkley books, they went for James Bond as a big, bold logo and used a variety of very strong colors, along with Bond in a sort of action silhouette pose. But unfortunately, this one leaves a lot more to be desired because they went with a sort of off gold and then put the silhouette of Bond on top of the Bond logo, and the silhouette is very small and it just looks rather plain, and because he's standing at an angle, it almost looks like he's about to fall over backwards over the James Bond name. So I've never been a fan of this design. It's basically, I think, a lesser version of the Berkley Charter US paperback designs, but it's okay if this is what you were going for, but as usual with this type of aesthetic, it doesn't suggest the story within whatsoever. In the US, we finally got another edition from MJF Books as part of their James Bond classic library of hardcovers. These all had the uniform artwork style of the rather cartoonish approach to depicting elements from the book, and these would often show moments that were not depicted on any other cover. So this actually depicts the motorcycle crash, and we see the body of the dead dispatch rider with a little trail of blood and the all-important case of secret documents. So this is basically what the killer sees as he walks up to the crash site. And there's even a nice splash of blood on the crashed motorcycle and the wheel. Plus, we have all the grass on the side of the road. So it's a really good image. I think the composition is good. It's just that the bold color, the sort of light green backgrounds, the blue used for the title, and the art style, it makes it seem a bit cartoonish. And that's always the one element you can't escape with these covers. Some fans absolutely hate them for those reasons, but you do have to give them credit for keeping to a unique design aesthetic and also depicting elements directly from the story. So I think it's a good cover for what it is, and you get what it's trying to do. It's just one of this series that I don't think is as effective as some of the others. The next UK Coronet Books paperback came out in 1996 as part of their modernized redesign. So this has the same James Bond 007 logo and the same layout as the others, and these all focused again on a very bold, attention-grabbing image directly tied to one of the books. And here, they actually chose the same thing as the MJF Classic Library Edition of depicting the death of the motorcycle rider. And so we have the actual gas tank, it seems, of the BSA motorcycle with a bullet hole through the logo. So this directly ties into the story. It is very effective and evocative, but only if you know the story. If you're just looking at this, you're only going to get the basic idea that there's a motorcycle and somebody's shot at. So I think for me, the big takeaway from this and what makes it unique is that you're getting all this express detail about the color of the motorcycle, and then it's a BSA motorcycle, and there's the bullet hole in it. So this is a cover that's stronger if you know what it's referencing. In 2002, we got another in the now iconic Penguin paperback reissue series with uniform design and gorgeous Ritchie Fahey artwork. So we have the stamp For Your Eyes Only once again. We have the Ian Fleming credit and 007 logo in the same style as the other books in this run. We have the central figure of a nude or nearly naked woman, who I'm thinking is supposed to be Liz Cress, perhaps. But again, as with all these covers featuring a beautiful blonde, it's left up to the reader to interpret who the female figure on the cover is supposed to be. But she's lying down, looking rather seductive, and rather amusingly, the figure of the bird, which is referencing to the birds outside the Havelock estate in the For Your Eyes Only story, and the motorcycle riders from A View to a Kill are strategically placed to cover up any actual nudity. And best of all, it always makes me laugh when you notice that the head of the motorcycle rider is covering her nipples. So that's very much like the classic title placements in the Morris Bender film title sequences, where the credits are strategically placed to cover nipples and other naughty bits to not get the censors mad at them. So this is a really evocative cover, which gives you all the flavor of the stories within, with direct things referenced, beautiful usage of color, and it's got the same matching aesthetic. So it fits perfectly with the other covers in this series and is another standout, which is another reason why the 2002 Penguin series is beloved by fans and one of the best print runs of the novels that's ever existed. In the UK and other territories, Penguin came out with their 2002 update as well, and this is the series where the covers are all depicting obscure shapes or images on black, with Fleming's credit and the title in the center in stylized but very straightforward fonts. These covers have never done it for me. I find them rather perplexing. They are striking in that you see them and you don't know what to make of them, and that's not necessarily the best thing for a book cover to do. Here, the shape almost forms a sort of smoky triangle, or it's just a reflection in metal at an odd angle. I still don't know what this is supposed to be. So for me, it's definitely one of the covers that I don't really like, because I simply don't know what it's supposed to be or how it's supposed to be connected to any of the stories, because it's not. It's just some odd shape in black. Much more successful is the Penguin Modern Classics version, which again brings back the figure of the bird, but here we have the red flowers and the overall mixture of red and black, which seems to hint more at the poetic flair and other qualities, especially some of the more experimental stories. And the bird reflected on the red in the bottom, it almost looks like a woman's knee or her leg poking in under the flowers. At least that's just what I've wondered, because I've only been able to look at images of this cover online. I've never actually seen a copy of this printing in person, but I think this is a big improvement over the 2002 Penguin cover, because it at least suggests the book somehow, and it's not just a random shape. It could also be a woman's shoulder with the bird sort of projected onto her back, but again, it's hard to tell just looking at low-res images online. In 2009, we got the Michael Gillette cover for Fleming's Centenary. This was part of a matching series where the artist Michael Gillette did these beautifully illustrated covers, each of a nude woman with the title and Fleming's credit basically tattooed on her back, as if in reference to the iconic Robert McGuinness tattooed nude woman for the 1967 Casino Royale marketing campaign. This has the added fun of the woman holding a martini glass, And it's got a nice flavor to the cover, but I don't know if it necessarily suggests any of the stories inside. But it is a beautiful piece of art that is part of this matching series, and the series is highly prized by Bond collectors today. In 2012, we got the opposite of that with the Vintage Books There Is Only One Bond series. This took that sort of generic tagline and applied it to covers that are all black and white and are very much sort of Photoshop mock-ups of location photos with a solitary figure stuck in them. So here it's supposed to be Bond, and it's Paris shrouded in fog because we've got the Eiffel Tower with the title in a sort of off gold slapped on the top and the 007 logo in the sky. This is very generic. I think this series is rather uninspired, but it is okay, I guess, because you get some suggestion of it being the figure of Bond and the location is Paris. So it is okay, I guess, but I have never liked these covers. And honestly, they're so generic, they seem more like test mock-ups than actual book covers. But this was done for some of the books at this point. More successful, I think, is the highly stylized Vintage 007 cover, also in 2012 for Vintage. And this has the same aesthetic of the title being turned into a piece of visual art with the Y's as part of the shaft of Judy Havelock's arrow, and then a bold orange background with the Vintage 007 on the top. So it fits with the others. It's a nice, striking usage of color, so it's attention grabbing. It suggests the story. So I think this is one of the best of the modern covers. The 2012 Thomas and Mercer edition is part of their uniform black, white, and red cover. And as usual, there's some parallel lines and shapes with the 007 logo as a red circle. There is some stylization here, but it also leaves a lot to be desired. These covers typically have lines and shapes that you have to scrutinize to try and figure out what the image is suggesting and if it's connected to the story at all. Here, the parallel lines are done at an angle, so to me, I think it's supposed to suggest waves or the sea. Then there's a bunch of intersecting extra lines at the center, which I suppose is the figure of a swimmer or a scuba diver, or perhaps the Hildebrand Rarity fish itself. But you do have to stare at this, and it's like a Rorschach blot. You have to look at it, and it's whatever you make of it. At least the For Your Eyes Only title has some stylization at the bottom, but I've never been a fan of these covers. At least it's unique artwork, I guess, but outside of that, it's just that it's uniform with the others so that they match. That's the one draw of these. In 2023, Ian Fleming Publications took over the books, and so we got the matching UK paperback with the same design aesthetic as the other IFP paperbacks. So here we have a stylized 007 logo across the whole cover with a nice sort of off-green background. And we again return to the figures of bird and flower, but it's the hummingbird here. So this is suggesting the For Your Eyes Only short story. This cover is okay, I think, but the 007 is easy to overlook. So it just looks like a book about the tropics or about a hummingbird at first. It doesn't really scream, this is a James Bond novel. There's also nothing from the other stories on the cover. So I think these covers are sort of hit or miss, but at least they have a uniform aesthetic and at least they're representing something from the book inside. The problem, of course, is that these feature the slightly censored texts. The Fleming estate, in making these books and on all subsequent issues of the books, decided to hire a bunch of sensitivity readers and make various small, slight changes to Fleming's original text, in addition to reverting to the US edited text of Live and Let Die as being the edition published again worldwide. The changes themselves were never made public and seem to vary. Some books may have not had changes at all, but they all carry a blanket statement that these are edited censored text to reflect modern sensibilities. This is not something that should have been done. I understand the Fleming estate had the best of intentions, but it means that these are compromised versions of the original works and should be avoided and actually boycotted. Unfortunately, all editions since this point in 2023 have been these altered versions of the books, and so they should all be avoided. This means that the US paperback edition by HarperCollins, as part of their updated line that came out in 2024, is also the censored altered text. And this has the incredibly generic, absolutely terrible artwork aesthetic of all of these. So we have a plain black background, extremely generic looking text that looks very cheap, except this one is colored an off orange. We have a generic 007 logo in the center, with the zeros being filled with a stock image, as these books have been proven to actually just use stock images. This is a stock image of an arrow. That's all you get. So this, for me, is the worst cover the book has ever had because it has the least amount of effort and is, of course, the censored text, and so it should be completely avoided. Also, the paperbacks themselves, when you look at them in bookstores, have a very cheap feel to them and have rather cheap binding and just feel rather flimsy. IFP also brought out a series of hardcover editions, which are sold on their website store. These all have uniform artwork by Michael Gillette, who returns to the series, and they are quite striking in a very stylized way. For Your Eyes Only has an eye as the obvious figure, but it's done with a bunch of geometric patterns and mostly green and black with some blue and yellow, and then the matching aesthetic of having the white bar on the top with the credits. It's a nice, bold, attention-grabbing cover. It suggests maybe some of the themes of the story, but also it's not immediately obvious that this is a James Bond novel. But it is a very attractive hardcover edition. The problem is, of course, it's the edited censored text for all of these. So in spite of the beautiful artwork and nice hardcover aesthetic, these are useless. If you want a modern edition that's still in print that features Fleming's unaltered text, your only option is the beautiful edition from the Folio Society, which is another of their matching slipcase, gorgeously illustrated hardcover editions that are meant for the dedicated book collector market. They do have a much higher price tag, though, so they are out of reach for most average readers and Bond fans. But these are the versions you might want to aspire to, or if you're determined to have a brand new edition with the original text, these are your only option. This once again features beautiful artwork by Faye Dalton, illustrating specific moments from the book, and on the cover we have a lovingly realized version of the meeting between Bond and Judy Havelock in the woods. So this is just absolutely gorgeous. The only issue is, of course, it is a much more premium and thus expensive item. Lastly, I'd like to mention the collections that feature the James Bond short stories. First, just as a side note, because I think it's so fun, in the mid-60s, we got the Bonded Fleming James Bond Omnibus that brought together Thunderball, The Spy Who Loved Me, and For Your Eyes Only, but actually put the first editions inside of a giant bottle, so it's as if your Bond Omnibus is alcohol. I just love the idea of it, and the title Bonded Fleming is beautifully done, so it's got a great sense of humor, so I just had to mention it here. When the Quantum of Solace film was made, all of the various James Bond short stories were brought together into a single volume and reissued under the Quantum of Solace title. So we got a couple variations, but the main one is a matching cover for the 2002 Penguin series with the Ritchie Fahey artwork. So we have a beautiful, nearly nude blonde with the same sort of aesthetic, but just a central solitary figure in the title, which is otherwise using a sort of off-green and blue for the colors to, I think, suggest the water themes of some of the stories. So again, the blonde on the cover may be representing Liz Crest, but it could be any of the characters in some of these stories. The other covers of this collection are much more generic. It's either a profile shot of a gun on a black background, or it's a woman's silhouetted profile. But this one, I think, is far more effective because the profile is done in a sort of yellow-red, almost suggesting that the silhouette is on fire and the silhouetted woman is actually smoking. But also, once again, we have the cheeky usage of the titles being used to cover the naughty bits. So it has that, frankly, titillation factor. And this was used on the Penguin Modern Classics printing of the Quantum of Solace collection. So if you're going to get this particular printing, I think the American Penguin version or the Modern Classics version is the one to go for, as the other Penguin version is just boring. Now to talk about editions in my own collection, I have what you see here, which are all paperback editions. My copy of the US Signet is a later printing, hence the 007 logo. This is actually a 24th printing, but has the otherwise iconic layout and design and is in rather nice shape. We also have the classic Signet white spine, and then we have the rear cover. You can always tell it's a later printing also by the fact that it has the iconic shot of Fleming smoking and the updated text to reflect the date of his death. There's the title page, and of course we have the iconic red-edged pages of the Signet paperbacks, and then each of the stories has the title with nice stylized text. Here is the 1981 movie tie-in Triad paperback. Again, this looks much better in person than images you'll see online, as the detail of the art is much greater and the color saturation is much more bold. Plus, you can try and make out a little bit more of the fine detail and background. Plus, we have the yellow hype label for the film. The spine is a bit on the generic side, and so is the rear. And then we have the stories with different typeface and much thicker margins than you'd expect. So part of the reason why this paperback is a little bit bigger is because it has much bigger margins. I have the standard edition of the Berkley 1980s paperback. Again, this looks much better in person than images online, as the usage of color is actually better and better realized here. I think the James Bond logo doesn't stand out as much because here on the actual printed version, it's a much darker plain blue, and so it actually starts to sort of fit in with the other colors. And you can also tell more detail in the action silhouette pose. We have the stylized logo on the spine, and then the standardized rear with black, white, and blue pictures of some of the other covers of the Fleming reprints. The other thing with these is that, of course, they have reset typeface, which is much bigger and easier on the eyes. It's not large print, but all of the Berkley Charter 80s paperbacks, also with the John Gardner books, have this same aesthetic. So you're actually getting a rather nicely readable version of Fleming's original Bond novels in this way. So that's another nice thing about collecting the Fleming paperbacks in these reprints. And these have gotten quite scarce, plus some of the Fleming reprints were not printed in very large quantities, so it can be rather difficult completing this whole set. And then we have the gorgeous 2002 Penguin version with the Ritchie Fahey artwork. The color and level of detail on this is absolutely sublime. I think this is a fantastic cover, and you get the wonderful wraparound effect with the artwork and color and everything just continuing from front to back, and even utilizing the spine as well. So everything about these is uniform with the other books, but each one has central figures and a beautiful color that is unique to it. Have the nicely stylized photo of Fleming on the front cover of all of these. Lovely typeface and design for the text. And then always ending with the stylized 007 logo on the inside rear. These are so beautifully done that the only problem is that they stopped printing them. These should still be in print today. They pretty much perfected the design and art of these. The only other issue is that they are a modern paperback, so they are prone to developing wear and page tanning. So when you find copies today, it's not only difficult to find affordable ones, but it's also difficult to find them in good shape, and it's also difficult to find them without the pages having some degree of foxing or browning to them. So those are my thoughts on For Your Eyes Only, which I think is one of the most underrated books in the James Bond canon. It had a particular genesis in being stories originally designed to be a James Bond television series that never happened, but it allowed Ian Fleming to try some different areas, experiment a little with the character, and in Quantum of Solace, completely step outside of his comfort zone. So I think it's really important for understanding Fleming developing as a writer, for the James Bond character developing. You get so much character detail in these works that I think they do need to be looked at as a whole, and I think they need to be looked at for their placement in Fleming's chronology of works. So it very much fits right after the Goldfinger novel. It's a transitional work into the later books. Again, you can't get to those. You can't get to On Her Majesty's Secret Service or You Only Live Twice without For Your Eyes Only and the other in-between stories. And so, in spite of these being short stories, I think there's so much contained within them that they are important, and it's best to look at them as the 5 brought together. When you read them with the other short stories in the Quantum of Solace collection, you sort of lose that place in time of where Fleming's head was at and how these 5 stories were developed alongside one another at the same time, as opposed to the other short stories that were written at other times. I think this book gets glossed over a lot by fans because it is a collection of short stories and it's not a complete original novel. I don't think it's necessarily intentional on fans' part, but it's much easier to focus on the complete novels and have less focus on the short stories, especially the ones that were collected into individual books, because later you have to also look at the Octopussy and the Living Daylights collection as its own specific set of stories written and published at a specific time. I've always enjoyed rereading For Your Eyes Only because of the great character detail, the extra insights, and also the notion that you're getting to see behind the world of James Bond into the moments between assignments, or not official assignments, or things that become adventures out of nowhere, and most of all for the bold experiment of Fleming in writing the Quantum of Solace short story. So ultimately, I think this is one of the books in the series that's most rewarding for fans to reread and look further into. As always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond, the works of Ian Fleming, and the printed editions of James Bond has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you're a fan of For Your Eyes Only, or you're also rereading the books, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Or if you're reading For Your Eyes Only for the first time, it is a real eye-opener, no pun intended, because it is so strikingly different in a number of areas and features some bold experimentation with the James Bond formula. Before I return in my next video in this series discussing the Thunderball novel, I just want to say, as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely vintage James Bond editions to add to your collection. Keep reading the incredible world of James Bond, keep bonding, and thank you ever so much for watching.